Welcome back, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed your breakout discussions and the networking break. We're about to get into our roundtable discussion, the role of public-private people partnerships in promoting social, affordable housing opportunities, advancing innovative solutions. It focuses on the challenges of providing and accessing social, affordable housing from the different perspectives of their inhabitants and those who enable and support their construction. And it explores new and participatory approaches to social housing innovation. Your moderator for the session is Puja Sawhney, Habitat for Humanity International's Associate Director, People, Public, Private Partnerships, Asia Pacific. Puja.
Thank you very much, Dean. I would like to welcome all the participants and the speakers for this really exciting roundtable that we're about to start. So as Jean set the context, I would just like to say that the need for adequate housing solutions, as we know, is immense, especially when the world is facing a global housing deficit. And across the globe at the moment, an estimated 2 billion people are in dire need for affordable, decent, and disaster-resilient homes. Now, the magnitude of the global housing crisis faced today is a function of multiple factors that include the kind of national housing policies and programs that are in place, the limited access to appropriate construction technologies and expertise, and absence of empowered communities and good governance structures within the housing sector. So creative and inclusive people-public-private partnerships, or P4 in short, has proven to be crucial in addressing affordable housing challenges and in delivering it at scale. So the P4 partnerships really are a useful sort of tool for addressing complex problems and also provide us with the opportunities to make these transformational changes and to make a difference on the level of the housing sector. So this session engages experts from the various sectors to jointly dwell on the challenges that are being faced in housing per se, and also in providing or accessing social and affordable housing from the perspective of the different actors. So before we start the session, a few logistical announcements from my side. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box. And if you have any questions for our speakers, request you to kindly type your questions in the chat box and also clearly mention which speaker your question is addressed to. And we'll be taking up these questions in the Q&A session after all the speakers have spoken. And now with this, I have the pleasure to invite our first speaker, Mr. Johann Baar, who is the Director for Affordable Housing and Technology and member of the Executive Board at the Hilti Foundation. Johann joined Hilti Foundation in 2017, covering a portfolio of projects which are related to social development, housing, and economic empowerment. In 2019, Johann was appointed as the Director of the Affordable Housing and Technology and a member of the Executive Board. And in this role, he also serves as a member of the Board of Trustee of the Base Baha'i Foundation in Manila, the Philippines, and the Advisory Board of Architecture and Development. Dear Johann, the floor is all yours, please.
Thank you, Puja. That was the long version of my CV. Thank you for that. Hello and good afternoon from Brussels. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Let me say as a start that I had the immense pleasure last night to join the opening event of this forum in person. It was fantastic. I had the chance to meet our partners again, to meet some new faces, and to discuss projects and progress, and also delays that we have experienced over the past weeks and months in our work. And obviously, we did experience some delays as countries continued to stay in lockdown. There were times where we closed construction sites, where team members returned to their home countries, and where movement also within the country was not possible anymore. All of us faced such problems in our work, I assume. What worked well, from my view, was the connection with partners online, the participation in panels like this one, strategy talks, etc. There was always the feeling we get things done because we had a great chat, we had new ideas, we felt aligned on targets, or even developed a new theory of change. Just recently, Actually, a few days ago, I had this great conversation with colleagues at the Hilti Corporation who asked me, your progress is that you talk. Does this really help us create tangible impact that you would like to pursue as a foundation? From a business perspective, it probably does not. And I believe here we are at the center of our 4P conversation. How do we move from talking to collaborative action at this important moment in time? How do we make stakeholders align on targets and activities across sectors to make sustainable social change a reality? And of course, this requires talking. It requires events like this one, where we discuss what works and what does not work, where we meet potential new partners, discuss new ideas, and share where we fail to create impact. When you ask me personally, however, how I measure the success of this forum, it is probably the number of meaningful collaborations that were started here based on our conversations. For that, I believe it is important that not only the usual suspects are with us, but we need to involve corporates, governments, and others to align on concrete steps for change on a holistic level. And even if we found these partners, often we are still not sure how to move from talking to action. How do we find partners that are not just willing, but bring the right set of competencies and resources to achieve our targets? How do we actively guide the work of these partners to creating relevant change? For all of us, those are challenging questions for which we have not yet found convincing answers. At least we don't have. If you have, please do raise your hand. To better understand what we can do to drive partnerships for change in the most effective manner, we decided last year to launch a new project with Habitat for Humanity, in which we hope to select 10 cross-sector partnerships. Our idea is to assess how they collaborate, to learn about the bottlenecks, and at the same time to provide active support to make collaboration work, to make it more targeted, more outcome-oriented, and in the end, more successful in terms of impact and scale. Let me share a brief overview of our work in the housing field at the Hilti Foundation to illustrate what drives our interest in this project. You probably know the Hilti Corporation as a leading developer and manufacturer of solutions for the construction sector, headquartered in Liechtenstein, Europe. The Hilti Foundation, in its focus area affordable housing and technology, in a sense copies this engagement by helping develop technical solutions for better and safer construction for low-income families to help them start their journey into a better life. What does this mean? It means we help develop products, services, and technologies that target the specific needs of these families. What makes a product or technology interesting for us? In the first place, that is, it needs to be affordable so that low-income families can afford it, at least with the support of a housing loan or a similar subsidy. Second, we only support quality products that are well-tested and proven disaster-resistant and durable. Third, products and technologies need to be adapted to the specific circumstances under which they get applied. Above all, that includes that they are so intuitive that also an untrained builder can apply them without a problem. We also support local production that does not rely on imports and helps develop the local economy. And lastly, we look for green products that are made from renewables or use the idea of a circular economy. One typical example could be a brick made from collected plastic that serves low-income families as an affordable and easy building material. Sounds all good and convincing so far? Let me get to the challenging part. It is not enough to develop a great product that meets all of these requirements. The product or the technology needs to be used. So how do we make low-income families know about a product? How do we make them trust that it does serve their interests better than the products that we know or that they know? How do we get the product to the people? How is last mile distribution being organized? How do we make sure people apply the product correctly? How do we register a product with authorities so that it's included in regulation, in building codes, etc.? How do we help families buy the product by making sure they have access to finance? Focuses on technical innovation. But in order to make a technical innovation create impact, we need to integrate it into an ecosystem that drives all of the aspect mentions in a connected manner. We need partners to make this happen. We need experts in logistics and financial mechanisms, regulators, corporates to join forces if we want to change how low-income families build and live. We need to work in networks that connects these organizations in a targeted manner. I'm extremely excited to learn more about the targeted management of P4 coalitions as we start our journey with Habitat for Humanity in driving change through such partnerships. And I really look forward to our discussion today. So let's collaborate to make change happen and not just talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johann, for a very concise presentation and for highlighting really how important it is to work in a partnership, how important it is really to collectively drive this movement. And as you highlighted that Hilti does a lot of work on technology innovation, I mean, some really great work, but ensuring the uptake of such technologies, you know, and access to it really requires working together in a network to drive this whole movement forward. So thank you very much. Appreciate that a lot. And I would now like to introduce our second speaker, Mr. Alexandre Frediani. I hope I got that right, Alexandre. He is the principal researcher for the human settlements at the IIED, and Alexandre specializes on issues around human development in cities of the global south. And his work also explores the various participatory approaches to planning and design of interventions in informal settlements in cities in Latin America and also the sub-Saharan Africa. So I would now like to hand the floor to you, Alexandre. Please, thank you.
Thank you, Puja, and it's great to be here with you today. Thank you for the invitation. And I'd like to start by maybe framing the question in a bit broader way. Why should we be talking about public-private people partnerships in promoting social and affordable housing opportunities? And to answer that first aspect of of my contributions here, I would like to understand housing not just as an end in itself, not just as an end to fulfill and protect people's rights for adequate housing, but also what if we understand housing also as a means to make cities more inclusive and more sustainable. So housing as a pathway for urban transformations. And I think that's why housing is so exciting, because we can see through housing a mechanism to bring very substantial changes to the patterns and the trajectories of urbanization in the cities that we live. So housing is a pathway because one, housing can advance or actually compromise citizenship rights. Having an address and a place to live allow you to have, for example, access to welfare programs, to access social protection. If it is needed for people to have even the right to vote and to engage into democratic processes. So if we're able to advance the housing, we are also integrating people into schemes and the possibilities to have access to particular welfare opportunities. Housing can trigger and disrupt also particular social and environmental lock-ins. We have seen, for example, how high-rise buildings in peripheral areas of the city is carbon intensive. It locks city into a form of urbanization that is not sustainable, and it also puts people in more marginalized, vulnerable places where they perpetuate that social lock-in. And this has been particularly relevant in the case of COVID, for example, where we've seen that particular housing conditions have generated those social lock-ins in terms of the health threats that people have been exposed to. And finally, housing struggle specifically has been a mechanism on the one hand for criminalizing actors from civil society groups, as much as a mechanism to claim for more democratic processes of deliberations on urban governance. So on the one hand, we've seen very often how leaders of social movements have been, as they've been trying to pursue access to adequate housing by occupying buildings that have been vacant for many years or land, and trying to realize people's access to housing has often been put in jail. In the case of Brazil, is very particular at the moment, where where there has been a systematic mechanism of criminalization of social movements. But on the other hand, we also have seen people that have been joining forces and claiming for more democratic ways of deliberation of the city. If we understand housing as a pathway, then before this partnership approach is not just necessary, it's a precondition. It's a precondition to achieve and fulfill these possibilities that housing brings about. So we are talking here about a model of partnership for the process of production of housing that is in my view, the only way if we want to really absorb and achieve the great potentials that housing can bring to make cities more inclusive and sustainable. So in this moment, that's when I would like to turn to the second part of my presentation that I like to then maybe bring to the discussion that it's not just any form of partnerships that can bring these possibilities that I've been discussing here, but partnerships needs to be based on a set of values of equity and of also emancipation, if it is to be able to trigger those benefits. And in my experience in the work that I've been involved in, seeing many initiatives from grassroots actors and social movements building partnerships in the context of housing, I would say there are three key elements that I think are important. Not the only ones, but I think that are very, very important in this respect. First, that marginalized voices and experiences need to be protagonists of change. I know I'm Brazilian, I come from a Latin perspective, and protagonism is a word that is used a lot in, it's more than agency, it's in the front line. You know, and those in the front line, if really we are understanding partnerships to be able to bring this transformation, then we need to have in the driving seat those communities that have been marginalized, that their experiences have been put by the side. And here it means not just creating coalitions and expecting that coalitions will naturally bring social justice outcomes. We need to acknowledge that those partnerships are full of power symmetries. Some people have much more conditions and abilities and also a set of norms, patriarchal, racist norms that perpetuate a series of inequalities. And so actually being the protagonist of change means disrupting those power symmetries within coalitions. And I think some examples that where I've seen this being done very successful is like the network of the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights. It's impressive of the different community-led initiatives and how this collective have been really faithful to this idea that is about communities being at the driving seats and really trying to sustain this ethos in the community-led processes. The second one is around how partnerships can build pathways for democratization. So in a way, it's not about just partnerships in the implementation of housing projects, but also how partnerships can be able to change the policy environment, the ways, the organizational structures within which governance and decisions are taking place. I've seen that, for example, in the case of Brazil, again, where there has been a massive success achievement by social movements that have been able to have a new policy of self-management at the national level in a moment that it's really one of the most depressing political moments of Brazilian more contemporary history, and they've been able to bring and to fulfill and to have a new policy, and that is a result of many years of engagement on partnership approaches, on community-led processes of housing production. As well, the other spaces that I think social movements have been very successful in, where partnerships have been very important to bring more democratization achievements, is around the master planning processes of many cities in Brazil, and housing networks that have been nurtured through housing processes have been used to then make the master planning process more inclusive in ways that they address a series of inequalities in the city. And so it's really interesting, this migration from a housing issue to a citywide, and where housing relationships that has been built through housing are now being utilized to bring about change in particular institutional conditions. And finally, the last one that I think it's really important is when partnerships are able to nurture relationships of care and solidarity across networks in ways that you're really building mutual learning and reciprocity. And I think this is where we see the huge potentials of networks in cities that across different civil society groups and other actors, as well as internationally. And I've been part of some of those experiences that are, for me, it's extraordinary. One of them being, for example, in Freetown in Sierra Leone, of how a city learning platform was established, bringing together a series of representatives of communities struggling for better access to housing opportunities. And they're coming together with also representatives from local and national governments, academics, and together they meet periodically to discuss issues that are affecting their right to housing and how they can make particular specific policy processes more inclusive to the needs of those that have been left out from housing opportunities. And some of them has been, for example, the Freetown Mayor's agenda of the Transform Freetown, that have now engaged much more seriously with issues of slum upgrading. And another experience that I've been involved as well that I think it's fundamental is the international translocal networks such as Habitat International Coalition, then ACHR that I mentioned before, Slum and Shack Dwellers International, the Global Platform for the Right to the City, as well as the Core Habitat Network that Bea Varnai, that is here with us, also might touch on that. It's an initiative that urbaMonde has been convening. And this type of spaces are so important because these are the places where communities are learning from each other, sharing experiences, and we've seen so much support for many entities that have a lot of resources, a lot of opportunities, and they're able to exchange know-how and opportunities, but we really see a much more skewed space for collaboration, for communities and their organizations to be able to learn from each other. And again, if we are talking about partnerships in the context of housing that bring about urban transformations, I think we need to be much more serious in providing support to nurture those spaces of exchange and collaboration across communities, because they are so important to be able to realize the potential that housing can bring to transform our cities. So I'll stop here and looking forward for the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alexandre. That was a very different perspective sort of to look at housing. Our housing doesn't necessarily have to be an end in itself, but actually a means and a pathway, which requires partnerships, really strong partnerships and strong networks to actually bear this to fruition. And cities, we know, are areas which are facing the brunt of the housing issues, with so many people migrating to cities. I just saw some statistics yesterday in the newspaper that in a couple of decades, well, maybe by next decade, you'll have at least 70% of the population living in urban areas. So this is really something urgent and has to be faced together. So forging networks and partnerships are really, really important. And I'm glad that you highlighted some of these initiatives that are out there where people can share and exchange their ideas and their voices to really address this very urgent issues. And thank you actually for mentioning about urbaMonde, because our next speaker happens to be from there. So I would like to introduce our next speaker. She's Miss Bea Varnai, and she's the project manager at urbaMonde, which is a non-profit organization and promotes community-led housing initiatives in Europe and also across the world. And part of her work really focuses on the design of financial mechanisms that are sustainable and self-managed, with the aim to really enable the access to affordable finance for community housing initiatives. urbaMonde also co-facilitates a network called Co-Habitat, which gathers some of the major community-led housing organizations from across the globe. So I'll now pass it over to Bea to enlighten us a bit more on the kind of work she's doing and the approach that the organization has on partnerships and on tackling the housing issue. All yours, Bea.
Thank you, Puja, for the presentation and also for the invitation overall. So yeah, we just heard about, of course, the crucial role of housing in achieving just and equal societies. Alex talked about the way that housing is a process and a driver of change. And I guess also needless somehow to say that this huge and enormous housing deficit that we're facing. Many of the speakers today touched upon it. It's both a deficit in terms of qualitative and quantitative terms. And part of it is also, of course, the question of housing affordability, right? The ability of households to access adequate housing and the quality of housing they can access. And there again, we're facing a substantial gap, not only actually low-income households, but also increasingly so middle-income households, the middle class. And this is probably true for, most of the world or even the world as such. And I think before diving into some more concrete examples, it's also important to remind also what is sort of the underlying cause or part of the underlying causes of this. And I think it's important to remind us that there's systemic reasons also for this. So we also already talked today about in other sessions about the financialization, the commodification of land markets, of housing, which are one of the root causes for this. And then, of course, growing populations and then also the unequal distribution of these populations in different territories and cities and in the countryside. So I guess one of the maybe just the conclusions or what we observe generally is that despite all efforts, the gap cannot be bridged just by public and the private sector action alone. And actually the role of communities and inhabitants or the people who use the city, who use housing, who are there is crucial. And they are actually, in fact, the major providers and constructors of urban space and housing as such. And specifically, if we talk about the global south, through a process which was coined as the social production of habitat. So this is sort of the background against which I'm also talking. And what I would like to do is just to present you a few very concrete examples, of partnership approaches, but also generally examples of community-led housing. So processes by which the communities are at the core of producing housing, their own housing solutions. So I will just share my screen here, and you will feel I may echo some of the things that we already heard from Alex. Sorry, just sharing here my screen. 1 second. Here we go. Sorry about that. So Alex just talked about, the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights, which is one of these major grassroots community-led housing organizations, or network of organizations rather. And this would be, I would like to talk about, different sorts of examples. So this would be an example in terms of reinventing housing finance, or the way, capital and finance is flowing to communities and households to satisfy their housing needs. So one of the examples is the community development funds that were developed by some of these grassroots organizations across Asia. And what is interesting is, that communities, they do save at the settlement level, at the city level. But what interestingly they achieved in some cases, or in many cases actually, to leverage public funds through their saving and to connect these their local savings to government funding, city funds, to funds that come through public authorities. And additionally, there's programs such as the ACA program, which many of you may know, that provided seed funding to these community development funds and basically achieved very interesting results in over 200 cities across Asia. So this is just one of the examples of, how community finance can also contribute to achieving these goals of affordable and community-led housing. Other examples in terms of finance, we could mention, to take a European example, the enabling financial environment that we find in Switzerland, specifically for nonprofit housing providers. So it's quite a complex system, but just to mention two very concrete things or tools that are available, those are state guarantees. The state is guaranteeing for nonprofits, including cooperative housing providers, leveraging very affordable housing finance for these providers. And another tool that was developed by the cooperatives themselves is a sort of solidarity fund, where they put together, they gather their own funding into this fund, which helps new and actually more small scale, more participatory housing cooperatives to access affordable, very affordable finance for developing their pilot projects or starting up their housing initiatives. And maybe also to mention another, just another aspect of this these financial tools that are at hand. I think we've all heard a lot about, ethical finance, microfinance, crowdfunding initiatives, impact investment, and all of these tools are sort of gaining ground, and also in the housing sector and supporting specifically housing needs. And I think increasingly there's people also ask the question of like, where are my savings going and how can I contribute also to initiatives that are for public benefit or community benefit more widely. So these are, I also invite you actually to listen to one of such an experience. Tomorrow there will be a session on an initiative of the Mobile Housing Network, which is a network of Eastern and Southeastern cooperatives that works on a housing development fund, which is a self-managed fund specifically for pioneering cooperative housing initiatives in the region. Another example or field where innovation can take place and is taking place is, of course, in the realm of land. We all know that land is costly. We all know that land costs are a major or at least substantial part of why housing is so unaffordable in many contexts. So stewarding that land and extracting it from this from speculation and speculative land markets is one of the ways of supporting the access to adequate and affordable housing. And of course, one of the examples for this are the community land trusts, which you may know have been developed first in the US and are spreading also to other spaces. So you will find community land trusts in the UK, you will find them in Belgium, also developing increasingly in major urban centers and bigger cities across Europe. But you can also find them actually in other settings. So for instance, here in Puerto Rico, where this specific tool was used for redeveloping and securing land and livelihoods for low income settlements that was actually threatened by eviction. So we could, of course, also mention many other tools in terms of, how to secure land and how to secure permanently affordable housing over time, land sharing initiatives, cooperatives that work on shared ownership of land and so on. And I was also listening to some of the sessions earlier today where we talked a lot about locally adapted solutions, really looking at how do people actually develop and how do they develop their housing solutions? How do they live together, come together? What are sort of their daily practices, and building housing policies or really any kind of policies on that. And one of the examples for this is the National Housing Policy of Namibia, which really try to embrace, incremental housing processes and to build them into a housing policy and providing technical but also financial help for these. We can also mention, again, to come back to Europe, examples of social housing providers, or really innovation in social housing and how we think about social housing. And there's many actors across Europe who work on this. Really looking at, okay, who's going to live there? What is their role in the process of building these housing solutions for low-income or middle-income households across Europe? And we could also mention, and this will be my last example, about cities that have decided, and public authorities that have decided to embrace local struggles, social movements. Some of the famous examples would be, of course, Barcelona in the past years, but also I believe there was a session on this even at this event about housing first approaches that were promoted recently across Europe. So I think maybe just here, my point is that, as many other speakers also said, there's lots of solutions, that are out there. They exist. And to conclude, just a few elements. I think one of the points that community-led housing puts forward is really that we look at collective action. So we don't only look at households individually acting and struggling in the market or in their lives to access affordable housing, but we look at how can we empower and support communities to come together and to build their own solutions. So that is one point that I think it's a very crucial point, because it's not only about putting people at the center, but also enabling them to come together and to build their negotiation capacity when it comes to negotiating these partnerships. And there I will echo some of what Alex said in terms of, any partnership really has power relations. So it's also about being quite straightforward about that. What is the support that we can give to local communities to be really partners at the eye level, of the solutions that are being proposed. And this is my last maybe thought for now, is just to say that these practices can be quite disruptive, and I think we have to be quite aware that they can be disruptive and enter even in conflict with some of the logics or some of the things that underpin today the not only housing markets, but Alex also showcased how housing is very much related to so many other levels of decision making of our lives and of governance. So I will leave it at that, and I look forward to our conversations later on. Thank you.
Did we lose Puja?
You may have lost Puja, yes.
Okay. This is Rick Hathaway. I think I'm next. I'll maybe go ahead and jump in then.
It's self-management now, I think.
Yeah. Oh, Puja, you're back there.
There she is.
You're on mute.
My apologies. Yeah. Yes, I apologize for that. And sorry, I missed the very last part of your presentation, Bea, but thank you so much for pointing out that there are systemic issues that need to be addressed, and it cannot be addressed by just one or two partners, that the communities are also very, very important, and it's also important to work with communities. Very interesting examples that you had highlighted. It is very good to see the lead that the communities themselves are taking on addressing the problems and the issues that they are facing. So thank you so much for highlighting that. And now I would like to ask our final speaker of the day, Rick Hathaway, who is the Vice President for Habitat for Humanity International and is responsible for the overall success of Habitat's affordable housing activities in dozens of countries throughout Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Rick previously served as the Vice President of Habitat for Humanity Asia, so he knows the Asia region really, really well. He was there for about 25 years. So even though he's managing now the Europe, Middle East, and Africa, because of his extensive experience even in Asia Pacific, Rick has a really rounded sort of experience on how housing works across the world and what are really the issues and the key challenges that we face. So over to you, Rick.
Thanks, Puja, and also greetings from Brussels. It's good to be with some of you in person and many of you online. And yeah, my experience with people, public-private partnerships, a lot of it's in Asia, but more recently in Europe and in this geography. And so we'll share a few examples of kind of Habitat's recent experience. But I do want to especially thank Hilti Foundation and Johann for their initiative to support really further development of best practices in P4, and appreciate Johann's partnership in that. So thank you, Johann. And was just reflecting on Alex's, I appreciate his focus on housing as a pathway, and Bea referred to that as housing as a process, which we often refer to in Habitat. Four walls and a roof is a product, and it's critical for decent shelter, but healthy transformation in a community comes from the partnership, and it comes from the process side of it. And while four walls and a roof is important, creating sustainability is all about the empowering people to be part of that solution. So thanks for your focus on that, Alex, and Bea Varnai as well, and appreciate you highlighting housing cooperatives and access to financing and people being able to access financing with their own initiative, and locally adaptive solutions and building policies that are built around local best practices. How can we be disruptive in a good way to help governments to realize that sitting in a room doesn't create the solutions? Understanding what people live through every day is a key part of the solution. So kind of building off of that, I thought I would share in more detail a partnership that Habitat's developed with many partners across Europe in the energy efficiency spectrum. We refer to it as RELI, residential energy efficiency for low-income households, and there's a part of this conference that's focused on that, and it is a problem that impacts in Europe more than 50 million people or more. Most of whom own their flat but have no ability to really maintain it. And they have many neighbors who have different ideas about that. So how do you actually renovate that housing stock in a way that's more energy efficiency? People are in poverty because they can't afford to heat their home, let alone the mold and the unhealthy nature that creates for families. So as we know, the maintenance and energy efficiency renovation of owner-occupied multi-apartment buildings, and especially in Central and Eastern Europe, is one of the biggest housing challenges. It affects affordability, energy poverty, climate change, and air pollution. We know a large portion of the population live in these buildings where they own their flat but don't have the means for investing in the maintenance and the energy efficiency of the commonly owned building, nor do they really have good supporting structures for collaborating with their neighbors. And the result is a deteriorating housing stock and growing energy poverty all across primarily Central and Eastern Europe. Millions of families whose housing situation is unhealthy, unaffordable, and really lacking proper solutions. And so Habitat and USAID began to cooperate on this initiative 10 years ago to renovate buildings. The first program started in North Macedonia. It then launched RELI as an initiative and then added projects and programs in Armenia and Bosnia or Herzegovina. And we're very grateful for USAID. They've continued that relationship, and we're looking forward to continuing that to just unlock and really help communities to be a part of the solution. It affects tens of thousands of buildings. So not any one organization or funder can actually do that. The market can do it, but we've got to unlock the pieces for that. And so the PPP approach to RELI is, again, focuses on 3 countries, but now we've expanded it through an EU grant to Lithuania, Ukraine, and looking to grow it beyond that. So the project helps establish, develop an investment market for apartment buildings renovation to secure the financial and political supports of governments, and to help homeowners under the homeowners associations, eligible players in the market. So how do we help families group together so they actually have a voice and they have a vehicle to actually drive their change? And so thanks to the activities under the RELI project, residents develop a plan, they organize the interventions. We work to establish trust between residents, lenders, construction companies, and local governments. And those were a lot of different players with different competing forces, and some motivated by profits, some motivated by politics. How do we bring it together to really demonstrate that it just makes good sense that people would have a decent place to live, lower the carbon footprint of buildings, and just lower the costs that people have to endure. And so within that, the people side, the residents and low-income households, they're the final beneficiaries of the RELI project. And for successful implementation of the project, they're formed into homeowners associations. In some cases, they have not, had that opportunity to form in that way. So what's the legal mechanism that's required? What's the governance required within those associations? And so that's a big part of it. It really is the key piece. We talk about people first, but it really has to be people working together and then being able to engage with the other parts. The public part, the local authorities and municipalities. So the homeowners association supported by an intermediating actor, in this case, Habitat and possibly others, build a dialogue with local authorities and municipalities to provide funding opportunities for energy efficiency renovations. So in the case of parts of Skopje, the government has helped a part of the renovation, which has enabled families to be able to unlock through loans another part of it. And I visited one of the buildings in Skopje a few months ago, and that homeowners association, which has now been in place for more than 10 years, they've taken on other tasks. They realized the elevators were not appropriate. They were substandard. So through a loan that they were able to acquire, they now have proper elevator. And because they now own that, own more than property own, they feel a sense of connectedness to it. They're going to make sure that's maintained. So again, it's the process that helps that in. And all the children growing up in that building know how important it is to work with your neighbors. So it's just that enabling environment which helps that next generation. And then the private side of it, the banks, construction companies, so the homeowners, again, supported by an intermediating actor, hopefully a temporary actor, arrange private loans in banks and manage the delivery of quality retrofit work. So Habitat is an enabler. How can we challenge banks to lend to homeowners associations, show them that they're very bankable, that this risks can be taken? How can we engage with the EU or other connected lenders that can guarantee loans if needed? And also, how can we ensure when they contract for the services that there's a good structure so they understand they're choosing a company that's able to do the work and able to do it well. And so the Relay ecosystem shows that the complexity of the decision making and how the system of stakeholders in residential energy efficiency can work and bring benefits to the homeowners and driven by the homeowners. Habitat, as the intermediating actor, enters the system and provides the initial technical assistance to homeowners associations and energy auditors, works with the banks, works with government, sometimes works with changing governments as elections happen, to ensure that it continues to be that enabling environment for ongoing homeowners groups to work with that. So in the last decade in these three countries, we've renovated a number of buildings and shown that it can be done in a variety of markets. And we've helped to challenge and engage key stakeholders. We help municipal and national governments to develop better energy action plans and long-term renovation strategy, homeowners to collaborate with neighbors and test new technologies, and financing organizations to develop and execute appropriate lending. And our collective efforts and learnings have led us to really better understanding the ecosystem and really better understanding how do you continue to make it better and more enabling for homeowners. And again, we've just, where it's been successful, it's really unlocked an energy that families have to support each other and to support being in a decent home and being able to continue to protect that for the future generation. So the strengths have been, I think, empowering homeowner associations, their internal coordination, and leading to the connection with government, banks, and contractors. And really the key, I think, going forward is to create that enabling environment. Unlocking financing, I think financing for homeowners associations is probably one of the pieces to go to scale that's not yet there. We've had discussions yesterday and ongoing discussions with the European Investment Bank and with others. I think that is the biggest missing piece. But the other would be government policy, both energy policy and housing policy. Sometimes governments look to the private sector for housing, and we need to help them realize their enabling environment for that within policies, within creating opportunities for homeowners associations to be successful, and continuing to mobilize best practices for ongoing maintenance and community governance. So that's a little bit about the Rely project. We continue to learn. Where do we learn the most? It's from the very families that live in the buildings, and help us to create that sense of forward-looking motivation. So we're thankful for the ability to partner with them, and was really grateful. Many probably online who are part of that partnership. It's a big problem, and we look forward to working with others to create new solutions. So back to you, Puja.
Thank you very much, Rick, for sharing the example from Rely. I mean, even when I joined Habitat, I'd heard from the very beginning, about the project, and the fact that it's been ongoing for a long time really, I think, is one of the keys to better understand, as you said, the ecosystem. We need to understand that better, really, to make it more successful, but also, look at the whole process of how the partnerships are formed. And it's important to really also understand this process, really, and also how it's highlighted how, in practical terms, partnership actually works. And if we really work together, then there is ample opportunity to make these kind of projects and programs long-standing, and also to build the necessary trust, really, which shows results in the longer term. So thank you very much for highlighting that. I think all our speakers really came from very different perspective, and it's enriched the discussions a lot. And I would now be going into the panel discussion part of things, and I have plenty of questions to ask all our speakers. So I would start with asking Johann, that you had highlighted a little bit about what Hilti does and how it works, but could you also kindly highlight, Hilti's experiences in terms of the collaborations and partnerships, and how does Hilti as a corporation really engage and work with the different partners? Thank you.
Thank you, Puja. I think that's an important question that you asked, because obviously the foundation is working in the third sector. We are trying to engage with NGOs mostly, but we also work, especially with Habitat's Terwilliger Center, on market-based mechanisms. We try to get corporates involved in creating networks that go beyond the third sector, and it is an important question for us. How can we make Hilti as a business get involved more? It is obvious Hilti is a manufacturer of high-end construction materials. Hilti works in the large-scale construction sites across the world. So the core business is quite far away from what we do as a foundation. And at the same time, we realize there's such a strong interest and such a strong support from our corporate partners in helping drive our work. So, for example, we supported Habitat's Tech Accelerator program, where startups from Latin America and also Southeast Asia in the last year were selected that develop technologies that can help low-income families improve their housing situation. What we try to do is connect them with our Hilti business to see, can we create mentorship roles with our colleagues to support these startups first in technical developments. And we have experts, engineers that work on regulation, for example, which is extremely hard for startups to understand on a national scale or to deal with. And we also try to support them with market analysis, with better tools and instruments that we've learned over time as a business work or do not work, and where we felt we could broaden the scope of their work. I think that's a pathway which we continue to do. But I know there are many more options and opportunities in the future when we look into green building materials, especially. I don't want to dive into that too deeply, but Hilti has just launched its sustainability initiative as a corporation, and we're starting to see many connections into the work that we do, actually, especially when it gets to renewables, our work with bamboo as a building material, where we feel we can learn and much more from each other, or even collaborate in what we try to achieve in terms of impact.
No, thank you very much, really, Johann, for highlighting the work that Hilti is doing. So thank you for that. I would now like to pose a question to Alexandre, and this is very interesting when I heard this from you, is if you could, from your experience, really, what do you think that, some of the innovative methodologies are there which can help to forge and deepen the partnerships in the housing space? Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Puja. Yeah, I think methodologies are super important because in the end of the day, when you are on the ground and you're trying to advance the partnership approach, which is process-oriented, that kind of engagement that we are discussing here, actually, built environment professionals are not trained to do that on the ground. That's not how what the basic skills that we get in our formations as architects, planners, engineers, is to work through that mechanism. So there is a whole process of relearning that many professionals in this field need to go through, and that's not a new journey. I mean, people like Nabil Hamdi has been engaged in this space for many years, precisely trying to think about that process of relearning many ways of working with people in ways that you facilitate, you enable, you strengthen particular relationships, that you are sensitive to power relations. So there is a whole set of mechanisms and instruments out there that I think is really interesting. I've been working with an organization called Architecture Sans Frontières UK for now more than 10 years, and we've been working through the participatory design and planning methodology called Change by Design, and that has been very important for us to engage with participatory planning through a scalar process in ways that we are engaging with the household, the community, all the way to the city scale of participatory planning, so that we don't just think about the local scale on participatory planning, that we actually open up this processes, and that we engage into also a series of stages from diagnosis, dreaming, developing, and defining in ways that open up possibilities of change, not in ways that constrain options and possibilities, but in ways that us as professionals we can support and contribute to open up other pathways of change that people might choose to go through, and strengthen the process of public deliberation through which negotiations are made. And again, engaging with the real hard question that this context of deliberation is imperfect, and therefore we need to engage with it and try to then make it more inclusive and democratic. So I think it's a key space and a key area that I think we need to continuously work through, is to create those methodologies that strengthen those processes and in ways that goes beyond the project time frame. That is actually those relationships are being nurtured even post occupancy, if we want to use this terminology, and so that we can actually continue developing those partnerships and processes in the long term.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Alexandre. No, it's very important really to look at what is out there in terms of methodologies and, to work depending on the situation, then work with it accordingly. So the follow-up question really, actually following up on what you were saying, Alexandre, to Rick would be also very interesting, because Rick mentioned about the Relay project and, the different sort of partners and stakeholders that are involved in the project. So Rick, the question to you really is, I mean, you did mention that there are different sort of partners and stakeholders that we are working with on the Relay project, but can you just highlight a few of those partners and the different stakeholders that we are working with in the different countries under the Relay project? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks Puja, and so it's a long list, and you know, success in a partnership is not how long the list is, but this one is long. You know, and I think so there are various coalitions, European Energy Poverty Observatory, Coalition for Energy Savings, companies, Knauf Insulation, so product suppliers, financial institutions, local institutions in Bosnia, Armenia, and Macedonia, international organizations, the World Green Building Council, and then, you know, municipalities and all the locations where the work is being done. And it's interesting, through this long list, you know, the reason why these projects like this, and probably all that we represent and are involved in, are needed is because the problem is huge. And has been indicated, not one group can solve it alone, but the partnership itself doesn't solve it. It's the way the partners work together, and really the persistence, because it's not simple. And so in going over this list, there clearly are those core partners that when it gets tough, they really get going, and they're going to be the ones that are going to be persistent with it. And not that the others are not, but, you know, the financial institutions, theirs is, you know, a particularly defined scope. But I think probably the key core partners, if, you know, building in Skopje, for example, is going to be the enabler, the intermediary, being Habitat in this case, the associations, and so there's, you know, they'll be by building, and then really the local municipalities that unlock key pieces to that. And I think it's the common vision that group has that really is the glue that helps all the other partners to contribute to it. And I think I'm just pointing on something that Alex mentioned. You know, these relationships don't just end at the end of the project. They are actually what creates the sustainability, because it's not the only problem to solve. And that ability to work together and to bounce ideas off each other, and to be disruptive but trusted, is really a key part of that. And so I think it's, you know, what's that core group that keeps that moving? And it really starts with the people side of it. They need to be the driver. We need to listen to them. And government does too. And that's kind of where I think a group like, in our case, Habitat, comes in, is to try to be that glue to create that trusting relationship that's really critical. Yeah.
No, thanks for that, Rick. Got the message loud and clear that, you know, we should be disrupted, but we should be trusted. So now the question to be really would be, you had mentioned about the cohabitat network that urbaMonde is. So just related to that, as a facilitator really of that kind of network, also it's a similar question I posed to Rick, is, you know, what it is that makes that kind of network work. So just want you to highlight on it. I guess it's going to build up on what Rick also said, but it's interesting really to see how, you know, this network works to bring other networks, like-minded people who have a common vision. So how do they sort of work together and engage with the communities, and, you know, what are some of the strategies that you have to work and engage with these communities? Thank you.
Thank you, Puja. Well, I guess there's different responses depending on which level we are looking at, but I really like how Rick highlighted that, you know, these eventually personal relationships also lead to, you know, building out partnerships on the longer term. And I think this is actually sort of underlying any human relations. So that can be at the neighborhood level in a housing association, but then also within international networks. So I think it's sort of this glue, as you said, that brings people together. More generally, in terms of the strategies and tools that work, I guess it will depend very much also on the political sort of culture, let's say. You know, some of the movements or organizations can be more confronting than others, and there's different ways of engaging your government or different stakeholders in a conversation around how to improve housing, livelihoods, and all of it. So, but I guess generally it's about building out sort of what we call this negotiation power of communities, and that can be by, you know, providing and putting something at the table. So it can be sort of in many cases, it will be, you know, data or just a knowledge about a specific sector. Rick also said, you know, we are learning a lot from the people we actually work with, the households we work with. And of course, it's those that are concerned that have most of the information and valuable information on how to find solutions. And this is even more true, I guess, in you know, in contexts of informal settlements, or where, of course, data and all of that is lacking. So that's one of the strategies that these kind of organizations have employed. Also, building out alternative and self-managed and own, for instance, financial mechanisms, without saying that it's going to substitute, you know, traditional finance or conventional finance, but it's rather like, what can you put to the table to engage the dialogue, to build a partnership? And you have to come with something, right? Especially you have to come with something when you're probably further down the power relations sort of line. So I think these are some of the strategies that have worked. And then also very much the idea of demonstrating and the proof of concept, you know. And I think this is where also it's crucial, the role of facilitators, Habitat for Humanity, but it can also be other, you know, organizations, associations of professionals. Alex mentioned Architects Without Borders. So it's also the way of demonstrating something that can be put at scale. And actually, I listened to one of the speakers, I think it was Anna Claudia yesterday, who mentioned this. She was saying, you know, scaling is also not necessarily about, you know, we have to come up with these huge solutions that are massive, but it's rather putting all these small things next to each other and learning from each other. And that's what's going to achieve scale eventually. So I think these are some of the things that are being promoted through these networks and also shared at the more international level.
Yeah, thank you very much. Given the paucity of time for the Q&A session, we will not be able to take up too many questions, but there's one question that I would like to pose to all of you and just request you for a very brief answer, because all of you have worked and have experience of having worked in different parts of the world with different kind of stakeholders, including, you know, the communities, the public sector, the private sector. So from your perspective, very briefly, for all of you, is what do you think, you know, from the lessons that you have learned, what it is that you would like to, the message you would like to give to the European housing providers or the local, regional and national governments and the policymakers who are working in Europe, given your background and the context from the other regions that you've all worked in. So just very briefly, Johann, just very briefly, and then Alexandre, Rick and Bea, and we'll finish the session there. Johann, please.
Oh, difficult question, Puja. I think, you know, when I think about it, I would like to go back to the corporate viewpoint that we can take as Hilti, and I would like to encourage all of us to use the channels that we have available to reach out to the important people, both in the corporate side, but also on the government side. I think for us as a corporate foundation, we can create channels into the business side of Hilti, for example, but also of other corporate partners of Hilti that are maybe not available to a smaller NGO. And if we want to use business and not just CER to create change, I think it's important that we use these channels to connect.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alexandre.
I think, in my view, I think we need to recognize that there are things going on already, and I think from often from policymakers and government operating in this field, starting from where the energy is, where the collective efforts are, And instead of trying to reinvent or creating new structures of representation, new committees, new spaces, I think partnerships is really about being able to nurture that energy of change that's going on. And I think to be able to recognize those collective efforts, and sometimes some of those collective efforts are outside the realm of what's legal, because that's where people are having to operate to be able to find room for change. And so how can governments then reach out to these processes, recognize, support them, and be able to nurture their development without taking away what makes them so powerful and so innovative, and so that we can learn from it, rather than just thinking about how can we include them into the systems that we had in place, without actually rethinking that maybe there's something wrong about that point of departure. So I think that would be my call. How to listen, how to support and nurture those other ways of achieving the right to housing, in ways that we can nurture those spaces and those collaborations. And I think through that protagonism that I was talking about, I think can be really safeguarded and promoted to bring about long-term change.
Yeah, thank you for that, Rick. In 1 minute, your take on it, please.
Yeah. No, I think there is a lot happening, as Alex mentioned, and I think we need to tell the compelling story about the need, and about the next, how do we help the next generation really to develop in decent shelter, and then I think really to define that it makes market sense, and that it's a sustainable process led by people. And so I think a lot of it's how we package it and tell the story to government, and at the same time challenge them boldly. Yeah.
Thank you, Bea.
Well, I guess I'll be echoing some of the things that were just said, but I get the feeling that we also move away in Europe from the certainty of either the market and this formalized market will take care of everything, or the state is sort of powerful and big enough to do it all for its citizens. And so we're looking at these third ways, and I think this is something that, at least in certain contexts, again, Europe is also not at all a homogeneous territory where things work the same way, of course, but looking at these third actors, at communities, at households, and at really at that level of the people, and including that actively into policies and translating into policies, I think is key. Yes, also here in Europe and elsewhere for the future.
Thank you very much for that. And with this, I would like to wrap up the session and would like to thank the speakers once again for their very insightful presentation and for sharing their thoughts. And I would also like to thank the audience for attending the session, and I hope they found it informative and that they learned something new with this. So with this, I would like to close the session and hand the floor back to Dean, who is the master of our ceremony for the next session. So thank you once again and have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Puja, and thank you to our speakers, Rick, Johann, Bea, and Alexandre, for some really thought-provoking talks. How can we find competent partners with whom our goals align? We heard some fascinating thoughts on housing as not just shelter, but a radical gateway to social inclusion, civic and democratic rights and equity, the idea that the marginalised must be the chief protagonist of partnerships. We heard examples of what can be achieved when marginalised low-income families are put centre stage in the development of housing policies and programmes in places like Namibia, Freetown in Brazil, but also in Milan, Lyon and Eindhoven in Europe. There are lots of solutions out there, but we need to move from talk to action. Fascinating and inspiring. Thank you all. We're going to take a 5-minute break now to set the stage for our final session of the day, our plenary session on diverse approaches and common challenges to housing in Western, Southern and Eastern Europe. Your moderator for the session is Gerald Kersel, researcher at the Austrian Federation of Limited Profit Housing Associations. Gerald is a sociologist and an expert on affordable housing and regeneration, and he's worked in Britain with the National Housing Federation and is now based in Vienna. He will lead us into the discussion after this break. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.